Hello everyone. Tonight, I'll be narrating two new creepy stories that I found off of the Let's Not Meet subreddit. After you've heard these stories, let me know what you think of them in the comments below. You be the judge. But without further ado, let's dive straight into their experiences.
These are their stories.
This story happened about 2 years ago while I was in university working on my degree in biology. I had signed up for a trip to gather samples for an experiment some students in the ecology department were going to run. It required the collection of samples from several sites, so they recruited biology, ecology, and forestry majors to help them complete the sampling in a shorter period. The area my group was to take samples from was a few hours from my uni in the Pacific Northwest. There are 9 of us in my group, 8 students and a supervising professor. We got to the campsite in the late evening and set up our tents. One of the other students had brought a big container of split pea soup from home and was sharing it with the others on the trip. I don't really care for split pea soup, so I declined the offer. Everyone had some except me, one other student, and the professor. Come the next morning, the 5 students who had eaten the soup weren't in the best of shape. They were in the grips of some gnarly food poisoning and were in no shape to hike for 8 or 9 hours to collect the samples we needed. The professor who was supervising us had originally set some rules, such as people travel in groups of at least 2 and we had to return to camp by nightfall. Now those rules were tossed out to make sure we kept to our timetable and collected all the required samples. We were just told to do your best to complete the work assigned as long as you can do it safely. That morning I set out for a long day of hiking. After a mile or so, I ran into the stream I was supposed to follow. I needed to travel about 4 miles upstream, stopping every quarter mile to collect samples of the water and soil. This meant I had to hustle to get back before dark. Halfway through the day I realized that wasn't going to happen. About 2 miles into my hike, I stopped for lunch sitting on a log overlooking the stream. The scene was really peaceful until I smelled the cigarettes. It wasn't the smell of a cigarette being smoked, more the musty smell of a heavy smoker's car where cigarette butts had been left to ferment for weeks on end. I looked around but couldn't see anyone. I just assumed that the wind had blown the scent of some hunter or hiker over to me, but minutes later the smell hadn't faded. The vegetation in the area wasn't that thick, but there was still a lot of places for someone to duck behind a tree or bush. I was unnerved that someone was apparently staying close enough to me for me to smell them for this long without so much as a word. I quickly packed up the trash for my lunch and continued up the stream. The musty cigarette smell went away for the next few hours. It wasn't until I arrived at my last sample location late into dusk that I smelled it again. The woods were getting really dim by this point. Looking back on it, it was a really stupid idea to stay out so late, as just hiking back to camp in the dark would be pretty dangerous even without a cigarette smoking stalker. Having just put the collection tubes in my bag, I shined my flashlight around the darkening woods looking for whoever was giving off the smell. I didn't see anything that caught my attention. It would actually be more correct to say I saw too many things in the dim light that might have been a head sticking out from behind a tree or someone crouched low in the foliage. I didn't like the idea of being in the dark woods with a stranger who for the second time was lurking near me without revealing themselves, so I began to double time it back down the stream. I made much better time on my way back even though it was dark because I didn't have to stop to take any samples. Even so, I didn't get back to camp till a bit before 10. I was the last one to get back and everyone but the professor was already asleep. I didn't mention the cigarette smell to the professor because he seemed tired as it was and he headed to his bed in the RV soon after I got back. I headed to my tent soon after. At some point in the night I woke up needing to pee. I decided to head into the woods to do my business as I knew some of the other students were still feeling ill and needed the RV toilet for more urgent matters than just having to take a leak. I walked about 100 feet into the woods, found a tree, and did what I needed to do. As I turned to go back to camp, something caught my eye. Somewhere off in the woods was a tiny, red glow. I was confused as to what it was until it flared momentarily and I realized it was the cherry of a cigarette. I stood there for a while watching the red ember glow, fade, then move slightly closer to the ground as whoever was smoking would take it out of their mouth. Not being able to see the person, I assumed they were watching the camp. I didn't know if they had seen me make my way into the woods or not, as the fire had been doused and the moon was only half full, so there wasn't much very light. I made my way slowly back to camp as quietly as I could and entered the RV to wake up the professor. I told him about the person smoking in the woods and about the smell of cigarettes earlier that day. However, when we got outside of the RV, the ember from the cigarette was gone. My professor woke the other student who had come down with food poisoning and we took turns watching over camp. I didn't see or smell anything else when I was on guard duty and went to sleep when the professor woke up for his turn. In the morning, the professor, the other student, and I went to where I guess the smoker had been standing the night before, and sure enough, we found about 10 cigarette butts on the ground next to a tree. The tree itself looked like someone had been twisting and stabbing a knife or other sharp object into it as the bark and outer layers of wood had been damaged and chipped away. The professor decided that the group should head back that day even though we hadn't collected all the samples we were assigned to be on the safe side. We packed up camp and drove down the thin dirt trail without incident. The second we got on the paved highway though, a white paneled van pulled out of a clearing just off the shoulder and began following us. This van stayed behind us all the way back, pulling off the highway when we did, taking the same service streets that we did, and only stopped following us when we turned onto the road leading to our university campus. Everyone was freaked out by this, but it was around 9 at night on a weekend, so the security office on campus was closed. We decided to unload the RV and call it a night as the van hadn't followed us onto campus. I offered to help the professor catalog and store the collection tubes from our trip, so it was another couple hours before I left the biological sciences building and started heading toward the dorm building I lived in. I stepped out into the cool night air and began walking, my professor having left the building in the other direction to get to his car and drive home. It was a couple dozen feet outside of the building, which was now locked, when I was hit with a musty smell of old cigarettes. I looked around and about 25 yards away in the darkness off of the footpath, I saw the cherry of a cigarette smoldering away. I was pretty scared at this point, but hoped it was only a student or some faculty staying late having a smoke. I couldn't completely convince myself of this as the musty cigarette smell was the same as what I smelled in the woods the previous night. I started down the footpath and soon passed whoever was smoking. 100 feet or so later, I looked over my shoulder and saw the cigarette cherry bobbing in the darkness. The smoker was following me. This creeped me out a bit more, but I still held it together. That is until I rounded a small stand of trees and saw a white paneled van parked alone in a parking lot. I took off at a sprint toward my dorm building. I looked over my shoulder a few steps into my run. I saw the cherry of the cigarette fall to the ground and a dark shape beginning to move after me. I didn't look back again, but I could hear someone running in the grass off of the footpath. I got to the entrance of my dorm building and frantically waved my key card in front of the card reader that controlled the door lock. As soon as I hear the soft beep, I open the door, jump through the doorway, and shut the door quickly. I stopped and peered through the glass door. I saw the dark shape stop just short of the lit pathway. I just watched for a minute or two. Then I saw the spark of a lighter. The light is just barely bright enough to illuminate a shaggy beard and brim of a baseball cap before it disappears and was replaced with the red glow of a cigarette. I turned and headed up to the stairs to my dorm room. By the time I get to my window overlooking the same yard I had just run through, there's no trace of a dark figure or a cigarette cherry. After that, I didn't see that white paneled van again or smell that musty cigarette smell, and I hope I never do. In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto, and we were still stuck living together after the breakup as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting, so when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping/fishing trip, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful, loads of lush forest, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing it was trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, talking, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a pretty good night. We turned in just after midnight. We shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably around 1:30 a.m. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember I was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping type noise. I was kinda groggy and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant and it sounded like a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment listening and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet away from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise woke him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided he would shine the flashlight on it and holler a lot, hopefully scaring him off. He unzipped the tent and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and babbled, "It's not a coyote, it's a dude. It's some weird dude." Normally I would have thought he was messing with me, but I've never seen someone look that scared, and I never want to see that expression on someone's face again. So I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on, and in retrospect, it really didn't sound like a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyways, he kept telling me to just look out the tent flap to make sure he's not crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust, and that's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was swaying a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful though, what was really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy to screw off. My buddy started yelling, "Excuse me, can you go away? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside the tent, but we didn't waste any time. We started yelling again, "Seriously, screw off. We have cell phones in here. If you don't screw off, we're going to call the cops." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off. It sounded like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified until the first sun of sunlight. Then we hightailed it out of there. I always wonder what that guy was doing out there, or what was wrong with him, but honestly, I never want to know. Alright, so that's it. Hope you enjoyed these stories. If you did, consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. But as always,
Have a nice day.